one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Neil, this is Houston, loud and clear.
2584, runway 24 left, clear for takeoff.
Welcome aboard Leading Edge from aerospacenews.com. This episode, like all our podcasts and videos, is made possible by the generous support of our listener crew. Please join up by visiting aerospacenews.com/fans and make any contribution you can afford. Every bit of support helps, no matter how small. Thanks. Welcome to another episode of Leading Edge from aerospacenews.com. I'm Craig, editor of aerospacenews.com and host of Leading Edge. Joining me today is John Ostrower, who is, according to his Twitter bio, editor-in-chief of The Air Current, a chaser of things that fly, an unapologetic geek, and a CNN, Wall Street Journal, and Flight Global alum. I would just add, I think he is one of the brightest, hardest working, and most talented journalists of things that fly in the world today. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Craig, and it's good to see that my check is cleared.
Well, so far. I'm giving another 48 hours. No, I'm a big fan, and as the audience won't know, you and I got to meet actually face to face recently, and it felt like I was running into a long lost friend or relative. A real pleasure, and thank you so much for being kind enough and generous enough with your time to join us on our humble podcast.
It's absolutely my pleasure. And for those of you joining today, well, Craig and I didn't overlap at the same time, but we are both alumni of Flight International and Flight Global. So certainly a shared professional lineage there.
It's very, very kind of you to say. So we're going to begin, as we do with our new guests, with our infamous or notorious or just routine Check 6 round. Are you ready for Check 6?
Let's do it.
Okay, Star Wars or Star Trek?
Star Trek.
And the reason why?
A lot of very fun memories. God, it's actually, it's hard. It's actually really a toss-up. I could read you chapter and verse on both. But I think as far as thought-provoking, I have to go Star Trek. Things that challenge me years later to think about things in a different way. I have to tip it to Star Trek.
Well, I'm on board with that, unsurprisingly as well. I also love the Star Wars universe, easy for me to say. But there's something about the relative plausibility of Star Trek and the forward vision, certainly in its origin in the 1960s, that I find very appealing.
Totally agree.
Dogs or cats?
Dogs.
That's the correct answer, by the way. Okay. This is going to be tough to answer quickly, but extraterrestrial life or humans alone in the universe?
Oh, extraterrestrial life. How boring would it be if 6 billion people who can get distracted by their telephones were the only, spacefaring life forms in the universe? God, that'd be so boring.
Completely agree. Have you, I know that your current status probably precludes this in the present day, but have you ever done online dating?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have, and yes, it does. Yes, I am very happily married, and my wife certainly frowns on that. Yeah.
Well, no, but I mean, you guys didn't meet on online dating, did you?
No, we didn't actually. No, we didn't. But we both did online dating before we actually met.
Something I would imagine neither of our parents' generations, even though mine would have been online dating for them would have been having papyrus carried by carrier pigeon. But none of our parents probably ever did that. What is your favorite airplane? Okay,
so I'll skip the story, but it is a Granville Brothers GB Model Z. So it's a 1930s racer with a gigantic. It's pretty much an engine with two tiny wings. That is, you'd know it if you've ever seen the movie The Rocketeer. It's the plane from the intro, and that's my first love.
It's basically an oil barrel with a propeller.
It basically is. It basically is. And my lord, is it beautiful? I think it just represents everything that's right about flying. Not necessarily aerodynamics, but just generally just the passion of it.
Interesting. Okay, almost done here. Do you want to fly in space? Now, not discount space like Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin have been flying to recently, but real space.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm a space camp veteran, so that's been in my blood for a lot of years. And before I was a geek and a lover of things that fly through the atmosphere, I was a lover of spacecraft, space exploration, which probably explains my Star Trek answer a moment ago. Also, so it's all very much connected. But yeah, I would do it in a heartbeat.
I'm happy to hear you say that. It's weird. When I was at flight, as you generously pointed out, thousands of years ago, there was one spaceflight correspondent, and the fact that I secretly was in love with space was something I couldn't discuss openly amongst the rest of my colleagues. They referred to it as space bollocks, anything to do with covering spaceflight. I think we've brought Guy Norris around a little bit, or maybe he was just in the closet about it back in those days. But now spaces certainly seem to be much more legitimate amongst the classical aviation journalists and aerospace journalists. Okay, let's turn a little bit more to what you're doing these days. What is the Air Current?
So I launched the Air Current after leaving CNN in the spring of 2018 to launch my own publication. And the Air Current is a deep exploration of the strategy and technology of the aviation business. So the goal is longer form, deep dive content that really moves the needle. And forgive the double euphemism in that, but the goal is to really there are a lot of fantastic aviation journalists working today, and they do fantastic work. And I have zero interest in duplicating what they do. I want to be additive to the industry in terms of the discussions that we have about air safety, about technology, about strategy, rather than just duplicate the headlines of the day in their immediate context. And again, there are journalists that do an exceptional job around the world. It's certainly we've seen that in the last year with all the aviation safety crises that we've witnessed. My goal is to create a new kind of tier of coverage that mixes forward-looking reflection, that mixes really kind of the big issues that we face right now. Is what is the strategy for the future, and what is the technology that's going to intersect with that strategy? And so I aim to, in every single piece that I write, to make sure to answer that intersection.
Oh, that sounds like it's a very high value level of content for an audience that I assume consists, well, perhaps not largely, but essentially of thought leaders within industry around the world.
Exactly, and that's certainly there certainly is a different subsets of our audience, but the big one is decision makers, folks who are grappling with these questions every day in their own business development decisions, their own strategy decisions, their own technology decisions, their own air safety considerations. In a very short period of time, we've amassed an audience that really is reaching thought leaders and decision makers on every continent save Antarctica. And so that really gives us an opportunity to have a deeper conversation. The goal ultimately is not to be the first to report something, though we absolutely focus on breaking news. The goal is to add a new level of depth that hopefully begins and ends with an inhale and an exhale that allows a more sober look at what we're looking at without sort of acquiescing to the whims of modern media pressures. You won't find sensationalism. You're not going to find hyperbole. Certainly, you will find context, and you find the proper lens through which to view the events of the day, and ultimately how to make sense of that in the larger picture for where this business is really headed.
Yeah, and for those that don't follow you on Twitter, I want to commend you for being one of the journalists who has consistently demanded that people require a very high standard of veracity and accuracy and verification. And let's see how redundant I can be from their sources before publishing breaking news. No matter what the agenda is of the publication, and by agenda I don't mean bias, I mean their goal. And you've been clear, on that subject, and you've been very vocal about it, and you're to be commended for it.
Well, I think I appreciate that, but I think that one of the big problems is that people have taken to keeping score in their own heads around who can do something first versus who can do something ultimately the best and most accurately. And so I think it's really easy, and especially in a medium like Twitter, to want to land that first hit. The problem is that it's like eating too much sugar. I mean, eventually you're going to get a headache, and you're gonna burn out on that. And so the goal is to slow things down. It's really slow news is in my estimation is the future, not this sort of hyper compressed bite-sized environment that we've been seemingly living more and more in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I was actually going to begin this section with a potentially very ponderous quote from Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, and I'm sure that you would probably guess where I was going to go with that. I copied it here, and I think maybe it's appropriate nonetheless to share with the audience, because as long ago as this was written, it feels to me, at least in journalism, if not in just our social structures and the way we seem to be interacting with each other as human beings all across the globe, it seems to encapsulate that. And if you'll allow me, I'll just read the first couple of lines, and it's this. So this is from A Tale of Two Cities by Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. Oddly on point, no?
So one of the greatest descriptors of a cell phone or mobile phone that I've heard in recent years is I have all of the knowledge in the world in my pocket, but I choose to use it to pick fights and look at pictures of cats.
Yeah.
know, and I think it's not quite Dickensian, but I think it's saying effectively the same thing, that you have access to this incredible well of information. Oh, by the way, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Not in our wildest dreams from 100 years ago did anyone imagine that would even be possible. Yet somehow this device has swallowed our thoughtfulness, and again, there's a lot of scorekeeping that I think people do in their own heads, and the one-upsmanship that takes place. And look, I think I hope that there. I think to in large measure, on a place like Twitter, for example, there was a time when Twitter was really fantastic. I mean, they used to describe Twitter as a place where Twitter was where you like the people you don't know, and Facebook was where you don't like the people you do know. And I think it was pretty accurate to some extent. Sort of connecting with old high school friends who you were questionably connected with, and you'd hear about all their. It's like I don't need to know that necessarily, but but on Twitter it was people who found each other with common interests, and there was a really really deep community there, and to some extent there still is, but it's been so sort of rolled over by, take your pick, whether it's state actors posing as bots trying to posing as real people trying to drive a wedge in the public discourse, whether it's people just being generally awful to each other with the benefit of anonymity, and or that someone's that there's an equality to your ignorance and someone else's expertise. and that because they exist on the same communications plane, there's somehow equality there, and there isn't. That's not that someone has taken the time to become an expert on the topic, and just because you have the general you, not you, Craig, you've gone ahead and formed an opinion based on whatever ideology or whatever small bit of information you have on a topic, just based on your gut reaction to something,
Yeah.
and I think that equal playing field is democratizing in a positive way, but it's also toxic if left to run to its to where we are today.
Well, this is all to why I wanted to mention the air current and the backdrop against which you launched it and the success you have found, because it does speak volumes about the merits of what you're doing. People are obviously sampling and then continuing to consume what you're doing because it's A, not available anywhere else, and B, they find it of value and nurturing to whatever their goals are. And it's a huge tribute to you because I'm seeing things like the BBC headlines turning more and more to question marks and clickbait. And that's an institution that I used to look up to, much like I did NPR and PBS, as being away from the miasma of local TV news, where they would run up to somebody who just had a relative killed in a car crash or with a drive-by shooting and say, "How do you feel?" That used to make me crazy. And people who are not in the industry of journalism associate or conflate the local news person with the pressures that their management is putting on them and their need for ratings and being able to get ads from the local hardware store, with the same thing that comes out of the Air Current or Flight Global or Aviation Week or the BBC. And as you and I both know, these are all vastly different organizations with completely different economic realities. I mean, looking again at what happened to the newspapers, local newspapers around the world, certainly in the U.S., and how bad that's actually been for democracy in the U.S., arguably, with the way that there's been less oversight of regional and local and state government, for example. So anyway, notwithstanding that, hat off to you and all you've accomplished and smooth skies and tailwinds going forward on the air current.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's very kind of you to say. I'm excited about what we've created, and I'm even more excited about where things are headed. So stay tuned there.
Yeah, and I have reason to believe that there's some very big news that gazes into the tea leaves about what's going to be coming from the Pacific. And I'll say no more. Just follow John on Twitter or subscribe to the Air Current to find out there. Let's turn to the 737 MAX. So much you and I could chat about, from the horrible loss of that 737 in Tehran to that story that I just hinted at coming from the Pacific. But I think the thing that would probably serve our audience the best right now is to take a deep drink from the teacup of your knowledge about Boeing and the 737 MAX and the development of that aircraft and the events that have unfolded since the horrific crashes of Lion Air Flight 610 in October of 2018 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 in March of 2019. Prior to these crashes, have you ever had a hesitation about getting on any modern Boeing-built airliner?
No. I mean, that's so. I think it's important to step back for a moment, because I think it encapsulates exactly what the challenge is for Boeing, in terms of where it is right now, is that there has been a profound lack of profound destruction of trust, and I think with that is central to what we perceive as safe. I think it calls into question the very meaning of the word safe, because safe is actually two different things, right? Mm-hmm. Safe is a flight test engineer and a regulator and an engineer and a manufacturer and coming together and saying, okay, we understand what this thing can do, and we can demonstrate that this thing can do this, and this is why it is safe and meets the spirit and the letter of the regulation that's set forth to establish its safety. Okay, that's one half of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the second half of it, which is, do I trust that? Is it enough, regardless? And again, I think it intersects, fairly gracefully with what we were just talking about Twitter and the equality of one person's ignorance to another person's knowledge on the same plane. But safe is also a perception. Safe is something that says we allow ourselves. How can the same person sit? Two people can sit in the same row. One person has a fear of flying and says, I don't trust this. The other person saying, oh, I totally trust this, and this is totally safe. But they feel totally differently. The same object that they're on, same conveyance, but they have two totally different feelings about it. So satisfying this idea of safety and the idea of the product safety is inherently a two-part question. I think the first part is far easier than the second part. And that the second part, which is the restoration of confidence in the perception of safety and the perception of trust in regulators, in engineers, in flight tests, in all of the intersection of all that to create a safe product. That's fundamentally what we're talking about here, because certainly there's a necessity, clear necessity, to make technical changes to the airplane that are being made. Right? You can do that, and you can test those, and you can demonstrate that they meet the requirements that you set forth. Again, the second part, the public perception, that feeling in your gut that says, I don't know, or maybe it says, oh, okay, no, everything's fine. But that is an intangible, and that takes a lot longer to address than just the technical side of it. So I think as we get into this discussion about what is safe or what gives a person hesitation, really comes down to these two parts, and the latter, how you feel, is going to be significantly harder to achieve in the long run.
Yeah. Well, for many of us who have been a part of this industry in some fashion over the decades, the revelations coming out about the executive decisions made and the priorities in place among Boeing executive leadership during the certification and sales of the 737 MAX are incomprehensibly earth-shattering. Were we all just drinking the Kool-Aid before 737 MAX, or was this program different?
I think what we've seen over the last 20 years, really dating back to the company's approach, I think most boldly with the 787, which was designed to actually be an underinvestment. It was designed to get suppliers that would pay their share to get on the program, and Boeing would only have to put up $5 or $6 billion, as opposed to the 10, 12, 14 that might otherwise be expected. It was designed to be an underinvestment.
Well, that was a plot twist.
Yeah. The irony is they ended up spending $50 billion on it. And so it ended up being a massive overinvestment. So then the next time around, you have to do an aircraft development. In this case, summer of 2011, when American Airlines ordered both the A320 Neos and this yet to be launched 737 with new engines, which became the MAX, forcing Boeing's hand. There at the time they were looking at a new airplane. It became another opportunity for this kind of underinvestment coming off of this massive plateau. I mean, you have to remember that 87 was not in service yet when the MAX was launched. It was, the first revenue flight was late October of 11, and this was July of 11. And so, they weren't done yet, and they hadn't even got into really deep into production at all, which still cost. Literally, they were losing, more than $100 million on airplane in production and cash costs, and it was just phenomenally expensive. So they exit that, and they go from this massive overinvestment to what we now understand to be a massive underinvestment. And don't get me wrong, the 737 MAX strategy the underlying strategy for the product. Just in the same way, ironically enough, the product of the 87 also was incredibly sound. That the market wanted a medium-sized, long-range twin-aisle airplane, and they bought them in droves.
Mm-hmm.
And because ultimately the price for that was very attractive against what Boeing believed that the return on its investment would have been. The same was for the 737 MAX. They believed that there was a large market, obviously racking up more than almost 5,000 orders for the airplane, and they did so and sold it for a very conservative price to airlines. So yeah, they gobbled them up, and they kept their market happy. They kept their existing customer base happy with a 15 to 16% improvement of fuel efficiency. But fundamentally, it's a continuation of the same idea. But the strategy, not just the product, but the strategy and how it was actually brought to market, we see in both cases where there has been a fracturing of the relationships, and I think far more severely in the case of the 737 MAX. But if you look through the recent spate of documents that were released last week from the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, 117 pages worth, you see a lot of the same themes about how Boeing was dealing with its suppliers designing the 737 MAX simulators, as you did for their supplier management techniques on the 787. So a lot of this is very much a continuation of the same strategic problems that Boeing has faced, and we have seen the consequences of that, and in terms of the reputation of the company, in terms of the perceptions of safety of the product, in terms of the actual safety of the product, in terms of there's these documents that again expose and illustrate really this incredible cost pressure for the bottom line that people in this program were under to meet schedule and to ultimately deliver a product that was not going to, under any circumstances, require a transitioning 737 NG pilot to use a simulator. And so we see this. I mean, you don't have to speculate on this anymore. It's certainly very much confirmed in these documents. Certainly, it doesn't have to be the same pressure or the same force on all parts of the program equally. I mean, there's a great line from the Sporty Game by John Newhouse from the early 80s. He said, there are marginal differences in the designs of these airplanes, but certain small features tend to take on an overwhelming significance in extraordinary circumstances. Which is to say, he was talking about the DC-10 in that context. But but effectively, what he was saying was the DC-10 as a full up airplane is safe. But when you look at the design of the slat tracks after several incidents, that how they design the slat tracks becomes very indicative of the overall of how it affects the perception of the overall airworthiness of the airplane. You can say exactly the same thing about MCAS and the flight control system in the 737 MAX. That it's a one tiny part of the MAX, but it ends up swallowing the rest of the discussion. And frankly, it doesn't have to be all parts of the airplane are unsafe for it to be an unsafe airplane. There just has to be and that's kind of what we've seen here.
Well, one of the repeatable lessons of the airline industry's commendable safety record, but with some notable bumps, is that it's sometimes very, very, very small things that end up bringing down an otherwise perfectly functioning aircraft, or one that should have made it to the end of the runway safely. It's a distraction. It's one light bulb that's out that's not on that one particular system. I'm thinking of Eastern Flight 401, which landed, in the Everglades instead of at the airport because there was a question of whether or not the gear was down and locked, and everybody got distracted trying to see whether it was down and locked, and the light bulb may or may not have been on in the cockpit. And an airplane that had no mechanical difficulties and weather that wasn't terribly bad flew into the surface of the Earth. And that's just emblematic. These things.
And that's the intersection of technology and humanity.
Yeah.
And again, I think most every accident, certainly accidents in the modern era, I apologize for cutting you off there, but every accident in the modern era has had some of that interaction, that intersection of, whether it's the human element of, whether the maintenance guy, didn't look at the jack screw, or they
right.
that humans are fallible, and whether it's your brain turns to mush amongst the simulation overload of a stick shaker and a clacker and everything, that you forget to pull the power, or your pitos are iced over and you decided to just lean the haul back on the side stick. I mean, it's again it's the intersection of humans and technology, and that has always been an immutable fact when we talk about air safety. And sometimes it is the root of the problem, and sometimes it's the technology that exacerbates it acutely. And I think that certainly, I think this situation, the 737 MAX situation, is far more the latter than the former.
Do you think that this has something to do with how the most senior executive leadership at Boeing seemed to shift from people that had airplanes in their DNA to people that were more generically business oriented?
Well, I think it's funny. I mean, I think that I think it's very easy to say Boeing has lost an engineering focus, which I don't agree with. I mean, for the last 5 years they've had an engineer as their CEO, and he was the first engineer to be their CEO in a very long time. And arguably one of if not the best CEOs that Boeing, or leaders Boeing, ever had was a lawyer, and that was Bill Allen. Who literally bet the company on the 367-80 to create the KC-135 and the 707, and that changed everything. And it's not necessarily an engineering ethos, but a long-term one. It does, and that does not require necessarily an engineering degree. It requires a trust and an understanding of all of the pieces of the company. And whether it's suppliers, whether it's the workforce, both the engineers and the machinists who build them, and all the other functions that surround that, your regulator, all of these pieces fitting together. And it doesn't have to be an engineer or someone with a precise technical knowledge to achieve that. Certainly I think look, Elon Musk is not an automotive engineer. Steve Wozniak, not Steve Jobs, wrote most of the code for the original Apple computer. But who are these forces that allow these companies to create big, world-changing products in a way that is additive, not destructive?
Yeah.
So, I don't necessarily think that it's, the focus away from engineering was a short-term one, not one that actually necessarily is the root of the problem. If that's a kind of a weird way to say it, but I think that getting back to where they want to be is going to require a much longer process that focuses on all parts of the company and de-emphasizes others. Certainly short-term. This is a long-term business. And has to remain a long-term business.
Well, since we're citing books that reference the industry, Boeing was the leadership case study in the book "Built to Last: The Secrets of Visionary Companies," and it spoke to how there used to be, and may well still be, a shared ethos and vision communicated from the top all the way down. And I agree with what you're saying with regards to the background of the leadership not necessarily being predictive of the success of a company, but it certainly has been raised by smart people that Boeing lost its way. And when you look at some of the communications that were just released recently that you cited vis-a-vis that congressional inquiry, you do see correspondence that seems to indicate that instead of being obsessed with making perhaps a more expensive aircraft that is inherently as safe as possible, there was more focus and attention paid to deliverability on budget and on schedule. And that breaks a part of my heart when I see things like that from any aerospace company, because there's a sense of this business. And I want to be really clear. I'm not here. This episode is not intended to hate on Boeing. The people who work at every level at that company, by and large, take unbelievable pride in building some of the most imaginatively created and finest, safest machines in the history of the human race or our species, to take race out of it. And justifiably so. These are machines that make some of us who have a romantic streak go, when we happen to catch sight of the tail of a 737, pivoting on a taxiway, or a 747. We still think secretly that's the queen of the skies. So this is a bit heartbreaking for me, at least. I feel like it's maybe almost a bad breakup that I'm going through here, because it's hard to imagine this happened in the Boeing of my youth. So
I think people want the best from these companies and this company.
Yeah.
And because it is so important, and I don't think it's not that it's similar but not the same as you say. Well, of course you want a car company to be good because your family rides in that car.
Yep.
This is look, Boeing. What you cannot they're inseparable. Is that Boeing is America, and any crack in that, any weakness in that, any not just chest thumping, the opposite of chest thumping in terms of showing strength, but a strength of a nation. It is certainly the nation's biggest export, but it also is very clearly an extension of I think what I think people look at as emblematic of the best of what American ingenuity can come up with. In the same way that Airbus is the same for European ingenuity.
Absolutely.
And I think, and there is, and same for Embraer in Brazil, and same with Bombardier in Canada. And by the way, no doubt that will also be the same for Comac in China.
Yep.
And so these become extensions of not just economics and politics, but a national ethos. So when they endure this type of scandal, and it is an incredible scandal, it strikes at ultimately, I think, how deeply people feel about their nation, and about their nation in the world, and about their national identity. And I think that is something that we haven't really explored through this process. But that's why Boeing is so important, and it is so inherently irreplaceable and unique in the American ethos. So I think that when this happens, we don't have 6 large commercial aircraft manufacturers in the country, and new entrants, popping up, small and large. This is the one, and I think it causes not just the incredible pain of these 2 crashes and the loss of 346 lives.
Yep.
But also what it does in terms of illuminating how what I think America had always viewed, a proud company, an emblem of its nation, has fallen so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that is so hard to understand, at least for me, is how this, at least on some level, and you may disagree with me on this, is a self-inflicted wound. There were opportunities, I think, for them to turn from the path that led to the decisions that were made. At least based on the correspondence I read. I'm not the NTSB. You don't speak for Boeing. Neither do I. So anybody who wants to comment on that, that we're maybe shills for the industry and in the YouTube comments, you'll be mistaken about that. But if I can speak for you on this subject, we both take great joy in seeing things fly, and especially seeing beautiful things fly, and to see them flying well, which includes safely, efficiently, and remarkably. There's a wonder in that. And the record here is very, very disturbing. For a moment, let's if we can drill down, because this got into a very sort of corporate management folder of thought, which I had not originally intended, but which I still think is incredibly useful, and is one of the areas where you bring in enormous value. But let's talk just, if we can, a bit about some of the systems and the decisions about what's on that aircraft, just to help maybe add some flesh to some of the technical misunderstanding bones that are out there, because lots of words have been thrown around about MCAS, which is the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. I've seen recent references to the fact that a system which I actually was not aware of is on 787. The synthetic airspeed was proposed and then rejected for MAX at some point. Can you talk a bit about some of this and where how the 737 MAX went to market in the shape it was in, and what some of those specific hardware technology consequences were?
Yeah. So it's actually, so one of the big fears, I remember Jim Albaugh, who was former CEO of Boeing Commercial Airplanes, telling me, he said, this is going to be a minimum change development. And that became sacrosanct. That was and minimum change meant only change it if you need to, and we're not going to creep into a much more complicated design. And actually, interestingly enough, Albaugh himself said that he was convinced that Airbus was going to end up unraveling a lot of the A320 because of the risk of essentially creeping design requirements for the airplane. That never happened for Airbus, but it did happen for Boeing.
Can I just stop you one quick second? Just to be clear, that's not new philosophy. This has actually been the way the industry has worked for decades. The idea is to keep the costs and the complexities for their customers to a minimum. This is just continuation of that. And the question is, how is it accomplished, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's interesting. I mean, you can't start this discussion without first, talking about the fact that the way that the decision to do MAX unfolded was the fact that they realized that a lot of this came down to dollars and cents, shockingly, right? Shouldn't surprise anybody. And so they looked at an all new airplane, and it wasn't just the cost to develop the airplane, but look, the 737 MAX is, the 737 as a product has, the most loyal customer base, and same for Airbus, for its customer base, phenomenally loyal, because and you don't just switch back and forth. You hold on to this because there's a continuity there, and there's a huge cost savings in the continuity, including pilot training, including maintenance, including spares, all these things, just and the infrastructure that exists. You don't go, you don't switch back and forth willy-nilly because of the investments that are required. So what Boeing realized is that if they did an all-new airplane, they would break the continuity with the 737. And if you broke the continuity with the 737, all of a sudden your customer base could look at an A320 Neo aircraft with essentially equality to an all-new Boeing aircraft, because the cost of bringing both on had negated the switching cost because it was gone, because you broke the continuity with the 737.
Right.
So what they determined was that they were going to lose a huge amount of market share had they did that. Had they gone and done an all new commercial airplane. So they said, no, we're not going to break the continuity. And then it got hyper focused within the program, which is we're not going to break the continuity, including giving any aircraft manufacturer, any airline, the ability to switch between aircraft manufacturers because one requires simulator training and the other doesn't. So it became that keeping that the delta, the switching cost delta, as great as possible, and not doing anything to sacrifice that. And that became a huge part of the approach here, which is, well, if we're going to do MCAS, we're not going to talk about it externally as MCAS. We're going to talk about it as a speed trim extension, and because we don't want to incur, a need for any additional training. And then they said that this is in these documents that were just released.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this situation where that ethos, that strategy that say we're not going to increase or alter the transition cost, because if we do, we make it more compelling to switch to Airbus, or we reduce that cost. And so that drove a lot of different aspects of the aircraft design. And so that's how we ended up with a lot of, again, the simulator requirements, with MCAS, with a lot of these different features. It's a very long way to answer your question, but again, that's the origin of this.
Right. And the technology itself, MCAS is, to the best of my knowledge, I haven't heard it being specifically mentioned as being a part of any other aircraft in the Boeing line. And maybe I'm about to reveal my ignorance, but is that something that's ever been installed on another currently sold aircraft?
So my understanding is that on a commercial aircraft, no.
Okay.
However, MCAS does exist on the KC-46 tanker. And my understanding was the implementation is slightly different. And digging into my memory here, I believe it's different principally because of the changing center of gravity of the airplane.
Offloading fuel.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And so it's a different implementation. That system uses two sensors versus one, or what was one in the case of the 737 MAX.
Okay. And what about synthetic airspeed? Actually, that was as I mentioned, a new vocabulary word for me. Do you know anything about that? Could you briefly define it and explain what it is?
Yeah, sure. So airspeed is for those who are not familiar with it, is derived by the static air pressure moving around the airplane and measuring it and figuring out how fast you're going. A synthetic airspeed system, which is on the 787, was available if the primary system fails. And a synthetic system literally it takes a bunch of different inputs, and I'm going to mess up exactly what they are, but I know that it's kind of like the same way of understanding the speed of the air around you, not necessarily the speed of the aircraft, but using GPS and the speed over the ground in terms of your ground speed as a means of calculating a synthetic version of airspeed. And it's actually pretty close. They came really close in the 87. And the way they thought it would be able to be used on the MAX, is my understanding, is that if you get an unreliable airspeed indication because of a pitot failure or whatnot, when you have unreliable airspeed, or the airplane believed it was approaching a stall, because if it showed the airspeed high or the airspeed low, given your relative angle of attack, it would offer kind of a backstop in that case.
It would be a system to vote on the actual status of the aircraft to either end a discrepancy or misunderstanding or break a tie. In the old days, when there were triple inertial navigation systems before GPS on airliners, at least, my understanding is that if there was ever a discrepancy between any of the inertial nav systems, one would be a deciding vote to break and figure out where you were. It's this goes to somewhat to the issue of the angle of attack indicators that were supposed to be optional or standard on MAX. There's been some discussion of that issue. I'm still a little fuzzy on the details, but Boeing said that you could, if I recall correctly, in the early days after the crash and the first hints of this issue being MCAS related, some were saying, well, it appears like they were only selling or including, was it the second angle of attack indicator vane sensor as an option, as an upgrade?
It was not the sensor itself. So there are always two angle of attack indicators on every 737, no matter what.
Okay.
The question was for this one, it's twofold. It was an indication on the primary flight display of whether or not you were going to get a message for angle of attack disagree, if the two sensors were disagreeing at any given moment. I think it's greater than 10 degrees for 10 seconds. I think I might be wrong about that. But the other one was actually an angle of attack indicator on the primary flight display. One is in the lower, I believe the lower right hand corner, and one is in the upper right hand corner. But if you had a heads up display, a HUD, you would actually have an AOA indicator on there when looking out through the combiner, which is the big glass plate that's in front of the pilot's face. The angle of attack indicator, if you didn't have the PFD, was an option, and that was a function of a bunch of things. Number one, it costs extra. Number two, Boeing made the case that it's not a primary vehicle, a primary tool for flying the airplane beyond attitude, speed, and engine indication, so on and so forth. You look at that and say, okay, well, those were the options, but there was also compounding that, which is not just that it was an extra option, is that airlines that actually had believed that they had purchased the option actually had it disabled because of a software problem that Boeing had discovered in 2017 and wasn't actually expecting to fix, I believe, until 2019 or 2020 with a software update. And the problem is they didn't tell the FAA about that. So any kind of indication of an AOA disagreement wasn't even available in a lot of cases, and also an angle of attack indicator as well. So again, it's one of those again, you talk about the Swiss cheese methodology of accident investigation, and each of these individual factors lining up over top of one another, and you would definitely count that as one of them. And certainly it was sloppy engineering, and Boeing even Dennis Muhlenberg apologized for that in terms of how they communicated about that. But again, from a perception perspective, it also served to reinforce a lot of what people were really worried about, was that Boeing was actually, that there were problems with the airplane, and Boeing wasn't forthcoming in fixing particularly that item as indication of that.
Okay, just to be 100% clear for me and for our audience, now these angle of attack indicators are presenting information to the flying pilots, but were they also not instrumental in triggering the MCAS system itself, which is actually seemingly at the root of the two accident events that we speak about, or two crash events that we speak about here? In other words, MCAS seemed to behave in a way, and correct me, I'm saying this out loud because I hope you'll correct me, but my understanding is what happened is that the aircraft began to think it was approaching an unsafe stall condition, and MCAS kicked in, and it would push the nose down, as stall recovery systems tend to do on modern aircraft, transport category aircraft, or even, I would imagine, tactical fighter aircraft and things like that. And it did so with such ferocity and force that the flying crew was unable to overpower it eventually, and the airplane literally pointed itself and flew into the ground in both these cases. But the aircraft was taking sensor data to initiate that behavior. The crew wasn't properly briefed, the allegations say, on that MCAS existed and what it would do, and B, it was operating erroneously because these aircraft were not, in fact, in deep stall or stall conditions. Have I got most or any of that right or wrong?
Yeah, no. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, and here's one thing that I think is worth mentioning. That the MCAS itself is not an anti-stall system. No, it what it was designed to do, and that it has kind of taken on a life of its own, is that, by the way, because of its ability to be erroneously activated, mind you, because of the design, it was really only designed for two very small scenarios in flying the airplane, and that was in a wind-up turn, so at a high bank corkscrew like climb, where you have a high angle of attack and the nose is pointed high, and you approach a stall. And the second one was straight ahead flight, and these are all with the flaps up and the autopilot off, and your hand flying. When you're pointed, straight ahead, you're not banking left or right, but the nose rises. That it gives it will activate the trim, and help bring the nose down to effectively make the control forces on the column feel, essentially have you increase the force in a linear way rather than it softening as you get to a certain point because of the upward nudge of the larger engines creating their own lift, essentially a moment on the upward pitch moment. So it was designed for this very a very obscure part of the flight envelope that was never going to be used or never going to be seen in normal operation. But the problem was, again, it was activated using a single sensor. And so, one of the big changes that Boeing is making is using two flight control computers to calculate that. That, by the way, that has come along with a host of other smaller human factors issues in terms of the indications of disagreement between these two sensors, which is why, in large measure, you have either one sensor or you have three, because two, again, you're not sure who's wrong.
Right.
But generally, again, in most cases, what the sensors will do is decide, okay, well, it's clear there's a disagreement here, and clearly you're not about to stall under the conditions that this was designed for. Therefore, we're just going to deactivate MCAS.
Okay.
I'd say it's not going to be activated,
Okay.
or it's only going to activate once.
And just to draw a line under this, though, the sensor that is sending the data to currently in the existing design, not the one that's coming, is a single angle of attack vane. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So it uses essentially a single angle attack vane connected to one of the two flight control computers.
Okay. And the allegations are, in the Lion Air crash at least, that one angle of attack vane may have in fact been troublesome on some prior flights and may have been defective on the accident flight. Okay.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
Just trying to make sure that, I know we're throwing a lot of acronyms around, and you and I have been in this a long time. Obviously, I don't understand every bit of it. I'm sure that you would admit you don't.
I don't either.
Yeah. But I'd like to try and at least bring the audience along as much as possible in this very complicated world, because if there had been two or more, I don't know if would be even possible to put three angle of attack vanes on, because as you pointed out, they tend to be mounted like whiskers almost on the sides of the front of the aircraft. And these are literally vanes that are blown backwards normally, meaning they stay in sort of trim with the aircraft flying through the sky. And as the nose comes up or down, they will move to reflect the way the wind is blowing past the aircraft, the relative wind, if you will. And that in turn is calculated to be an angle of attack, the angle of attack, or AOA, being described it's been a long time since I got my pilot's license, but it's the angle of attack. Help John here. It's that angle between let's just keep it simple, the relative wind or the horizon and the nose of the aircraft.
Or
the chord.
Wing I think it's the position. Yeah. Oh man.
The chord, the center of lift. I don't know.
Oh God, I'm on the spot here.
No. I don't know it. I'm a pilot.
Yeah, it's certainly the angle of the wing relative to the flow of air over the wing, right?
That it sees, basically. Yeah. It's and a higher number indicates basically nose pointed up towards the blue stuff. Lower number or negative number would be down towards the brown stuff. So I once shot a cover for Aviation Week of an F-16 flying at 90 AOA. The F-16 had the nose straight up, but because it had a thrust vectoring engine it was testing on it, it was actually flying literally sideways. So the AOA was 90, but the velocity vector was straight back. And I mentioned it not to pat myself on the shoulder, but to say that the direction that the nose is pointed is not necessarily in modern aircraft the same the direction that the airplane is moving.
No, so. Exactly. And another way to think of that in kind of a more less dramatic way is crosswind. That right? It's the same idea that you're pushing in one direction. There's a force on the aircraft, in another in requiring it to crab in a direction. Which also, if you have two angle of attack sensors, sometimes often produces different readings on both sensors. So I would imagine
if you're imagine if you're banking, for example, in that corkscrew climb, for example, would be a perfect opportunity because of the differential in pressure on the underside of the aircraft versus the upper side of the aircraft. So that would perhaps be a circumstance where those two would be in disagreement. It might be why you also give them time to disagree before you act in response to that. That sort of thing. So, okay. So moving back now, the aircraft had these systems on it, and Boeing clearly was getting some feedback, especially after Lion Air, that something was wrong. Were they timely in trying to address these, as far as you know? And again, you're not the NTSB, you don't speak for Boeing or the FAA, but you've covered this story. What were the next milestones?
Well, hindsight certainly is 2020, right? But I think that in large measure, I mean, what we've seen in terms of the documents that have come out, that Boeing was aware that there were questions around, the assumptions that went into assuming a pilot would just respond as they would in a regular runaway trim situation, and also whether or not a single angle of attack vane feeding this was a sufficient safeguard. And so, we the question is, how much weight were those given at the time? Again, we certainly have seen definitively that the approach was to limit anything that would cause either a additional certification changes or additional pilot training. So Boeing didn't immediately act to step in and say ground the airplane. They started off by saying there will be a software fix, and complicating things further was that the government shut down in January of 2018. 2019 rather, and that slowed things down considerably as well. But again, we saw the Ethiopian crash in March of the following year, and I think the way that it was being approached, they did not want to ground the airplane. They did not believe that there was necessarily an immediate need to do that. We now understand that was in hindsight a false choice. When there was a push to look at this through the lens of pilot training and a maintenance problem, but as soon as we saw that there was a common thread after Ethiopian, China grounded the airplane, or actually I should say, let me rephrase that. China didn't ground the airplane when they saw a common thread. They grounded the airplane when they saw the macro context of an incredibly safe air traffic system and two crashes of a new airplane in the span of 5 months. And they said, we need to stop and understand this. And the rest of the world followed suit. And so a couple days later, I think if I recall correctly, China grounded on the 10th. And 3 days later, the U.S. and Canada on the last day, when there was clearly indications that horizontal stabilizer trim and the MCAS system was going to be a keen focus of the inquiry. But again, as recent as near in as a couple hours or a couple days or a day before, Dennis Muhlenberg was on the phone to President Trump, according to the Washington Post, urging the airplane not be grounded. So Boeing was brought into this, and even with, again, the what is now the hindsight of understanding what engineers' concern was around how this was being implemented.
Have you, well, I think I know the answer to this question. Have you got, well, I know that you're aware of this, forgive me. I was going to ask if you had seen it, but I think you actually were the person who maybe retweeted or tweeted it out. What I would like to ask eventually, if I could get it out of my pie eating hole, is what are your thoughts about the letter from senators to Boeing about the concern they have over a $7 million incentive payment to CEO David Calhoun for getting the 737 MAX back to service?
Politicians are going to be political, and a lot of there is a lot of partisan anger that comes along with this. I'm not saying it's a partisan decision, but that Boeing and the Trump administration were perceived to be very, very close. I think that has affected a lot of what's unfolded here, certainly politically, in terms of what's gone on Capitol Hill. However, this also strikes me, certainly, as a close watcher of this company and its reputation and how it interacts with the public, as an unforced error on its part.
Yeah.
That if you are aware that what the criticism is and how people view this, maybe steer clear of that. Maybe don't add a specific financial incentive for returning the airplane to service safely. Because if the criticism is that you are profit driven above safety, even if you say the safe return of the MAX, does David Calhoun need any additional incentive to bring the airplane back safely? I don't think so. But again, in an attempt to solve one of these problems, it's number one, it's the perception of the company. They've essentially brought an unforced error upon themselves, and I think that's what comes of that is unclear. But certainly, I was surprised that no one stopped and scratched their head about that before deciding it was a good idea, and whether or not it could take a different form. If you wanted to keep the same structure for incentives.
I agree with you 100%. It strikes me, to use some slang, as tone deaf. It's incredibly tone deaf on the company's part, and it seems to place a monetary value almost on what's transpired before. This kind of brings us back around just a little bit to one of the topics we had discussed a bit offline, and also maybe you'll share with us a moment in Twitter history that you managed to make when you were some years ago inside the a Boeing building. But quite a few years ago, a friend of mine who actually was a very senior communications executive at Boeing, now long since retired, told me that one of his greatest fears was that the company, institutionally, actually, he was expressing this on behalf of the company, was terrified that they were not going to be able to recruit and find young people to come work for them and to work in the industry more generally in the future. Like they literally thought this was one of their biggest challenges beyond engineering or finance. It was, can we attract the right people to come work for us at every level, or to maintain the aircraft we sell, or to fly them for our customers? And this goes to that issue of being tone deaf, and the industry itself seems to be suffering from this, where around 787, things changed with the way the media was handled by Boeing. I was recanting the stories with Guy Norris on the A380 episode about all the quote, our English friends call them jollies, when when Boeing would and a customer airline would invite the journalists to come along on a delivery flight, and usually there'd be some time to get to know the executives both at Boeing and at the airline for several days before and after at the destination. And while the relationship wasn't, quote, permissive, in other words, it wasn't something where misdeeds would be excused if they were otherwise covered by the journalist, especially the quality people like yourself and Guy, it at least enabled an environment of mutual communication and trust. And people could do their jobs professionally, and there was sufficient access for there to be an understanding. Well, the message I think that's not getting through to the executives across the industry is the people that they need to hire are not going to come work for a business that feels off-putting and disinterested in the humanity of life on Earth in 2020. There needs to be a very different approach taken. I'm unabashedly in love with things that fly, and I'm not saying I'm doing it right. What I'm saying is that I loved working for Flight International, as a matter of fact, even though I also worked for AvWeek, because Flight had a sense of humor. We had a straight and level page. It wasn't all crew cuts and folks named Bubba. Not there's anything wrong with guys named Bubba, but it wasn't only that. There's a ubiquity of that. In a seriousness. And so, you are an unabashed geek. And what did you do a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away in the Pacific Northwest? A young man with facial hair.
Actually, I don't think I had facial hair then. Actually, to go back far enough. I was capable of growing it. Thank you very much, but I just didn't have a beard then.
I see.
So, but I think back in the days of the 777, folks would tell me stories about how they would, just effectively be invited in to come see the latest status of the early 777 test aircraft. Mm-hmm. They just casually, and that went away when 87 came around. And but the thing is that was all happening right at the ascent of social media. Mm-hmm. And the story that you're alluding to is I hold the dubious honor of having sent the first tweet from inside the Boeing factory. That I'm aware of. Certainly, the Boeing Communications was aware of. And sitting here in 2020, this is going to sound crazy, but they freaked out, and because they felt that it violated their rule against live broadcasts in the factory. Which by the way, that was not a universal rule. Matt Lauer on the Today Show had done several live broadcasts from inside the factory in 2007. So it wasn't exactly like I had violated some, it was the seriousness of that rule was very relative, but mm-hmm. But certainly they didn't know there was a sense of oh my God, what if the information is wrong? What if the broadcast, the tweet, the broadcast is somehow needs to be corrected, or it doesn't have full context? It's that they couldn't, the time they just weren't able to wrap their heads around the idea of 140 characters in those days, 280 now,
right.
Around talking about their airplanes. And it introduced Boeing quite painfully to social media and Twitter. I would sit at the back of briefings and I would tweet what they were saying, and they would get really uncomfortable about that. And I'd have a PR person come sit next to me and say, hey, well, just to let you know, there's this blah blah blah. And it's like, okay, well, it's a tweet, and it's crazy that we're here in 2020. But again, a lot of this, the irony was that as I was carrying an iPhone in those days. And I still do, right? Mm-hmm. But what Boeing sort of, didn't realize was that all of their employees were moving towards social media as well.
Right.
And so, there you go. I mean, it's that we all moved into this new media realm together, where when this was all colliding as things were going wrong in the factory on the 8th.
Right.
And so what happened was they found themselves in a position where they said, okay, hold on. Well, we need to, we need to fix this. and the communication inside the program is dreadful. No one has any full picture of what's going on. Leadership isn't getting a good picture of what's going on. So there's this incredible pressure inside, but all the information is leaking out the sides.
Right.
And people are using social media to do that, whether it's public or private channels. They're doing that. They're getting in touch with reporters, myself included, and so the information flows. So what any modern company has to deal with is the fact that you're the digital age offers this it's a double-edged sword. It's every there are 130, 40, 50,000 people at Boeing, almost all of whom certainly have social media accounts and have the ability to be in touch with journalists, and not in a kind of a secret parking lot meetings. It happens in a bunch of other different channels that are far more transparent and far more easy to get a hold of. So again, we see Boeing, a high tech company, an incredibly high tech company, has found itself on the front lines of not only a changing landscape for its airplanes, but a changing landscape for how people communicate. And that goes for how the media perceives them, how the media discusses them, how people perceive them. Because again, for better or worse, we're talking about an environment where, unfortunately, the voice of an expert and the voice of someone who doesn't have expert knowledge, that's an equal playing field. And where something absent context or absent information or absent background is tweeted and it goes viral, regardless of whether or not it's accurate beyond the understanding of the person tweeting it. And so,
right.
And again, I'm really been lucky. I'm teaching a class on this exact topic about accident preparedness and media, and how the influence of social media on how airlines and aircraft manufacturers respond to air accidents. And so it's something that I spent a lot of time looking at. So it really does does color the way you do business. And frankly, I think there will be ample case studies written not only about the business and engineering side of what has befallen the 737 MAX, but the media landscape that it exists in. When the DC-10 did its go through on its grounding and in the aftermath of Flight 191 in Chicago, that it was the three major networks and then major newspapers that carried forth the news. And the irony is that there was a quotation from the time that said that there was some airline executive that was still lamenting the fact that news coverage was carrying any half-filled ashtray on the DC-10 on the nightly news, and there's truth in that. But the problem is the same thing is now happening, obviously will undoubtedly happen when the MAX comes back in service, and those are things that Boeing cannot control. You can't control that. I mean, and one of the things that I've sort of been asked about is, should Boeing rebrand the MAX? And the answer is no. Of course you shouldn't, because the only way to get back the reputation of the airplane is not through a new name that seeks to convince people that the airplane never existed. The troubled airplane never existed. The way to get the reputation back from the MAX is just to go win it every single day and to fly it and fly it safely. And you can't. And the hardest thing is going to be accepting that there are aspects of this that Boeing will not be able to control, and that's going to be a huge guide as this comes back. And whether it's someone accidentally pulls an escape slide, or or there's a runway excursion, or something goes off, blows a tire. Things that happen in the normal operation of an aircraft, that are dramatic, but not hazardous by any means in the same way as what befell the Ethiopian and Lion Air aircraft. But
Yeah.
again, it is probably going to receive a disproportionate amount of media coverage. And frankly,
Yep.
The if there were any in-flight shutdown will no doubt as well. I mean, there was actually a pamphlet that McDonnell Douglas actually put together on the DC-10 after the grounding, which actually pointed out the number of in-flight shutdowns on the 747 and the L-1011 versus the DC-10, and the very demonstrably lower amount of coverage that those incidents received relative to the DC-10 when it happened in far lower numbers. So again,
Sorry, I was going to say why didn't they include the the Lockheed Constellation for that matter?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Right? So yeah. But that's it, right? It's like, it's that the problem is that we're no longer talking about technical veracity. We're talking about, again, where we started this conversation, which was about, again, this perception of safety versus the technical reality of what we're looking at in terms of the actual demonstrable, measurable safety and robustness of the system, which is only, again, half or part of the equation. The part of the equation that we're talking about here is, again, the perception of, do people feel safe, and ultimately what reinforces that feeling of safety or breaks it down.
Is it true that your source, or one of your sources at Boeing over the years, you went by the code name of Deep Throttle?
I'm not aware of that. No.
Okay.
No,
Sorry. When you were talking about parking lot meetings.
Yeah, that's there were.
Came to mind.
I've had source meetings in many places, but never parking lot. Actually, wait, no, that's actually not true. That's actually never. I'll just leave it at that.
Are you? And I don't mean to put you on the spot here. Are you persona non grata at Boeing at the present time, or do they just fear you?
I try not to think about it.
Okay.
My relationship with Boeing has changed and evolved over the years, and there are times when I have been more enthusiastically welcomed in, and other times not. And that tends to change depending on administration more than anything. But overall, I really try not to think about it, because I feel like I in some respects have the dubious honor of I've been kind of Boeing shrink for the last 12 years, and regardless of official invitation or access. So
right.
Understanding what makes this company tick and how it thinks and how its people feel is something that I've spent a lot of time engaged in, and thankfully, some journalists really do require a level of gatekeeper approved access. I have tried to reduce the necessity of that to as much as humanly possible. And so, and that's a function of using the tools at my disposal, and also just taking the time to listen to the people who are working there and how they're feeling. So.
Right. Well, clearly you've been successful at that. Well, let me ask you one last question about the 737 MAX program, and I believe it's something that you at least will agree to lick your thumb, stick it up in the air, and take a guess at. Hopefully, do you have any idea, or what is your best guess on when the MAX will return to service? Because I think we both agree it's going to return to service at some point.
I've asked myself every single week, is there a chance that it doesn't come back? And I haven't gotten to that point yet where there's a chance that it doesn't come back. It's going to come back. What state it comes back in, how people perceive that is anyone's guess. I have been wrong every single time, but I think that I think we're getting closer than farther away. But it's entirely possible that certainly American Airlines just earlier today said that they would bring the airplane back in June. So it's going to be, so we still really have about 6 more months to go before this airplane is under this current schedule. By the way, that's the 10th time they've had to push back that return date. So I've it's safer for me not to guess at it, only because I'm almost certain to be wrong.
Well, no one will blame you, I think, for being wrong. There are so many things that even someone like yourself, I would imagine, can't see going on beneath the surface here, between the discussions with the customers at Boeing, the FAA, which we really haven't spoken about nearly enough, the role of that regulator, and even Congress's oversight role. But perhaps if you're willing, you'll come back another day and we can touch on that and a lot of other things I'd love to discuss with you.
That sounds great. I'd love that.
Well, that would be wonderful. How can folks subscribe to the Air Current?
Yeah. So go to theaircurrent.com or subscribe.theaircurrent.com, and you will see our how to subscribe right there on the page. There's also follow me on Twitter at John Ostrower, and certainly on Instagram and Facebook and all the other different social media platforms. But please come to your current, take a look at what we're offering, and ultimately what I can promise right now is that very exciting that we're going to be embarking on an expansion very soon. So more on that very soon, to increase the value of what we're doing. And ultimately ensure that we're on the leading edge of coverage of this industry. So, Craig, thank you so much for the opportunity. This was really, really enjoyable, and I look forward to doing it again soon.
John, thank you for saying so, and thank you for joining me on this edition of the podcast. And needless to say, I would like to be chatting with you on a daily basis over a beverage of our choices, whether it's coffee in the morning or something a little more intoxicating in the evening. Wrapping this up, then, the wheels are stopped and the chalks are in. Thank you, folks, for listening and sticking with us on this long, unusually long episode, which I'd actually hoped was going to be closer to about 25 minutes, so I could leave you wanting much, much more. But please be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform and rate the show on iTunes. It really does help us. If you want to ask a question or leave a comment I can answer or share in a future episode, visit anchor.fm/aerospace-news and click on the send voice message button. Who knows? Maybe your comment or question will make it into a future show. My thanks again to John Ostrower for being a great guest. We'll catch you next time on The Leading Edge.
Neil, this is Houston, loud and clear.
2584, runway 24 left, clear for takeoff.
I hope you enjoyed that show, and thanks for listening. You and others in our listener crew made this episode, like all our podcasts and videos, possible. If you've not already joined, please visit aerospacenews.com/fans and make any contribution you can afford. Every bit of support helps, no matter how small. Thank you. Copyright 2020, all rights reserved.